A girl confesses to her father the abuse she suffers from her stepmother. Suspicious, he hides to see what is really happening, and the truth he discovers is shocking, forcing him to make a drastic decision to protect his daughter. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, while the soft lights of late afternoon filtered through the cracks in the curtains. The house was silent, except for the low sound of the TV broadcasting the evening news. Lorenzo, 35, was sitting on the sofa, but his mind was far away. He stared at the TV screen, but he wasn't paying attention to a single word the news was saying. His gaze was lost in the recent memories that tormented his thoughts. It was hard to believe that a year had already passed since the tragic death of Angelica, his wife. The accident that took her was so brutal and sudden that Lorenzo still struggled to process it all. Even harder was seeing how his daughter, Beatrice, only 8 years old, was dealing with the loss. She had always been a cheerful girl, full of life, but now she seemed to have closed off, as if morning had silenced the shine she used to carry. Lorenzo remembered how everything changed after Clara arrived, the new presence in their lives. He had met Clara at work, and their relationship started casually, without any great intentions. She seemed like a kind and balanced woman, someone who, in a way, offered comfort in the midst of the emotional chaos he was living. Over time, Clara got closer to Beatrice and gradually settled into their lives, eventually moving in with them. Beatrice initially seemed to accept Clara, but as the months went by, Lorenzo began to notice a subtle change in his daughter's behavior. She was quieter, more reserved. It was as if something was wrong, but Lorenzo, still immersed in grief, couldn't see what was really happening. That afternoon, Beatrice entered the living room silently, her steps too soft for a child her age. Lorenzo glanced at her and soon noticed something different. The girl who used to run joyfully to hug him after school now seemed hesitant, with her shoulders slumped and her gaze fixed on the floor. "Beatrice, sweetheart, is everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound carefree but already feeling a hint of worry in his voice. Beatrice looked up for just a second, enough for Lorenzo to notice that she had been crying. Her eyes were red and watery. The girl bit her lower lip, a gesture he knew she made when she was nervous. That put him on alert. "Daddy, can I talk to you?" Her voice sounded low, almost a whisper. Lorenzo felt a tightness in his chest, a bad feeling taking over him. He gestured for her to come closer, patting the sofa beside him. "Of course, sweetheart. Come here," he said, trying to convey confidence. Beatrice hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached and sat down next to her father, but kept an unusual distance between them. Lorenzo frowned. He wasn't used to this distant attitude from his daughter. What was happening? The silence between them felt suffocating. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" he insisted, trying to find a clue on his daughter's face about what was troubling her. Beatrice didn't meet his gaze. She began nervously fiddling with the hem of her dress, clearly struggling with the words she wanted to say. Lorenzo waited patiently but felt the tension in the air. I don't know if I should say it, Daddy," she murmured, almost to herself. Lorenzo tried to stay calm, but a growing discomfort began to wash over him. Beatrice had always been very open with him. She had always trusted him. What could be so difficult to say now? "Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm your father, and I will always be here to protect you. You know that, right?" He spoke gently, but his heart was racing. The little girl took a deep breath and then finally looked up to meet his gaze. Her eyes were filled with fear and anguish, and what she said next left Lorenzo paralyzed. "Daddy, it's about Clara," Beatrice began, her voice trembling. She hurts me when you're not here." Her words hit Lorenzo like a punch in the stomach. He could barely breathe. His mind refused to accept what he had just heard. "What?" he stammered, trying to process. "What do you mean she hurts you, Beatrice?" The girl began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. "When you leave for work, she gets mad at me for anything. She yells, says horrible things, and sometimes she pushes me hard. It hurts, Daddy. I was scared to tell you." Lorenzo felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, that Beatrice was exaggerating. But looking at his daughter, seeing the despair in her eyes, he knew she was telling the truth. Clara, the woman he had allowed into his home, was hurting his daughter. "Beatrice." Lorenzo tried to speak, but his voice faltered for a moment. He hugged her tightly, feeling tears welling up in his own eyes. "My love, I'm sorry. I didn't know." The girl cried in his arms, and Lorenzo felt the weight of guilt fall upon him. How had he not noticed before? How had he let this happen? Now there was no room for doubt. He needed to protect Beatrice, and that meant Clara could no longer be a part of their lives. Lorenzo remained seated on the sofa, still holding Beatrice as his mind spun in a whirlwind of thoughts. The silence in the room was overwhelming, filled only by the soft sound of his daughter's sobs, which gradually began to subside. What he had just heard seemed impossible to accept, as if it were a nightmare from which he desperately wanted to wake up. Clara, the woman he had brought into his home, was hurting his daughter. He stroked Beatrice's hair, trying to calm her, but the anger and guilt were growing inside him like a storm about to explode. How could he have been so blind? How had he not noticed the signs before? "Sweetheart, you promise me that you are telling me the truth?" he asked softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "You know you can trust me with anything, but I need to be sure that what you're telling me—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words seemed to fail him. Beatrice pulled away slightly from her father's embrace, wiping her tears with the backs of her small, trembling hands. Her eyes, still glistening, reflected fear but also an unexpected firmness. "I'm not lying, Daddy," she said, her voice now more controlled but still heavy with emotion. "I was scared to tell you before because she said that if I spoke, you would be mad at me and send me away." Lorenzo felt his heart tighten even more upon hearing this. He looked at his daughter's face, seeing the innocence stained by fear. The idea that Beatrice believed he could abandon her because of this was an almost unbearable blow. "Beatrice, my love," Lorenzo started, holding his daughter's small hands in his. "I would never, ever be mad at you for telling me something like this. I love you more than anything in this world. You know that, right?" Beatrice nodded slowly but still seemed reluctant. Lorenzo realized that the fear planted by Clara had poisoned the girl's natural trust, something he would need to rebuild. But right now, all that mattered was his daughter's safety. "You did the right thing by telling me, sweetheart, and I promise from now on, I will take care of everything. Clara, she will never hurt you again. Okay, I swear that to you." Beatrice looked at her father with wide eyes, seeking comfort in his words. Even so, there was a trace of doubt in her gaze. For a child who had faced so much, the safety offered by Lorenzo was a momentary relief, but the emotional scars were already present. "You promise you won't be mad at me?" Beatrice asked, almost like a plea, desperately wanting to believe that everything would be all right. "I promise," Lorenzo replied firmly, his eyes filled with pain and regret. "This was never your fault. Not at all. And I will take care of this. I will protect you." Beatrice nodded and snuggled back into her father's chest, hugging him tightly. Lorenzo held her gently, feeling the weight of that promise becoming more real. He knew that from that moment on, he needed to act. Lorenzo continued to hold his daughter for several minutes while his mind raced. He needed to confront Clara, but that required caution. What would happen if Clara denied everything? He knew he couldn't allow her to continue living there after hearing what Beatrice had told him, but at the same time he needed proof, something that would make the confrontation undeniable. "Beatrice," Lorenzo said softly, trying to find a way to protect his daughter and resolve the situation at the same time. "Can you tell me anything else about what happened? Since when did this start?" Beatrice hesitated for a moment, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her shirt. She seemed reluctant to relive those moments, but she knew that for her father, she would do her best. "I think it started after Clara moved in here," she spoke in a low voice, avoiding her father's gaze. "At first, she just yelled when you weren't home, but then she started pushing me when I did something she didn't like. Sometimes she pinches me when no one is looking." Lorenzo felt a fierce anger grow inside him. How had he not noticed this? He blamed himself for not having seen the signs, for not paying enough attention to Beatrice's behavior. "And why didn't you tell me before, sweetheart?" he asked carefully, knowing the answer would be painful. Beatrice shrugged her shoulders, her expression visibly uncomfortable. "I was scared. Clara said that if I told you, you would be mad at me and that no one would believe me because she is an adult, and I'm just a silly child." Those words were like a blow to Lorenzo's heart. He couldn't believe that Beatrice had carried that burden alone, afraid of not being heard. And worse, Clara had planted that horrible idea in his daughter's head. "Oh, Beatrice, my love, I would never do that to you," Lorenzo said with a heavy heart. "You are the most important thing in my life. I will always believe you." He kissed his daughter's forehead, holding her tightly. From that moment on, Lorenzo knew he had to act quickly to ensure Beatrice's safety. Clara could never harm his daughter again. That night, Lorenzo could barely sleep. The weight of Beatrice's words haunted him at every moment, and the image of his daughter crying in his arms kept him awake, filled with anger and guilt. He got out of bed several times, going to Beatrice's room just to make sure she was safe. Finding her sound asleep, clutching her stuffed animal, gave him a brief relief, but the torment in his mind continued. He knew he needed to take action and fast. Clara was out that night, but she would be back home soon. Lorenzo decided that the confrontation would happen that very night. He would not allow Clara to spend another day with Beatrice. His daughter had suffered enough, and Lorenzo would do whatever it took to protect her. However, there was one question that kept hammering in his mind. He needed proof. If Clara denied the accusations, and Lorenzo was sure she would deny them, it would be her word against Beatrice's. And he knew Clara was manipulative enough to try to turn the situation around, using her influence and charm to make him question his own instincts. That's when an idea sprang to his mind. He decided he needed to see for himself how Clara behaved when he wasn't around. The truth would be revealed, and there would be no way for her to escape. Lorenzo devised a plan. He would pretend to leave for work the next day as usual, but he would actually come back and hide at home. He hid in Beatrice's room, in a spot where he could observe without being seen. From there, he would witness Clara's behavior with his daughter and have the proof he needed to confront her. The next morning, the atmosphere at home seemed calm. Beatrice, still sensitive, gave her father a long hug before he went to work. Lorenzo reassured her, promising that everything would be fine. When Clara got up, she seemed oblivious to what was coming. Her actions throughout the morning were ordinary and carefree, but Lorenzo knew what lurked behind the mask. He said goodbye with a quick kiss on Beatrice's forehead and a "see you later" to Clara, who responded with her usual smile. As soon as Lorenzo stepped out the door, he waited a few minutes in the hallway, feeling his heart race faster than usual. He knew that once he re-entered the house, everything would change. Using the spare key he always kept hidden, Lorenzo silently entered the house again. The silence was almost deafening, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Moving cautiously, he made his way to Beatrice's room, where he hid inside the closet, leaving the door slightly ajar. From there, he had a perfect view of his daughter's room. He just had to wait. The minutes dragged on as if they were hours. Lorenzo could hear Clara and Beatrice moving around the house, their voices mere whispers in the distance. But then, something changed. Clara's tone became harsher, and Lorenzo felt his heart race. The anxiety consuming him began to morph into pure adrenaline. He heard footsteps approaching Beatrice's room. His breath grew heavier as he tried to mentally prepare for what he was about to witness. The door to Beatrice's room creaked open, and Clara stepped in. Her demeanor was different, more threatening. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at Beatrice, who was sitting on the bed, nervous. "Clara?" Lorenzo said, his voice low but filled with contained anger. "I heard and saw everything. I heard every word. You just condemned yourself." Clara tried to regain her composure, but Lorenzo saw the panic in her eyes. She knew she was cornered. "Lorenzo, you're misunderstanding," Clara stammered, trying to approach him. "I was just trying to discipline her. She's confused. You can't take this seriously." "Discipline her?" Lorenzo stepped forward, his anger overflowing. "You were threatening my daughter, hurting her. I saw the bruises. I heard your threats. There's nothing you can say to justify this." Clara seemed about to respond, but Lorenzo interrupted her. "Get out of my house now, and if you come near Beatrice again, I will go straight to the police with what I saw and heard today. And believe me, I won't hesitate." Clara, realizing there was no way out, backed away, her face pale and disoriented. Without saying another word, she quickly left the room. Lorenzo heard the front door slam shut a few seconds later. Immediately, he knelt beside Beatrice, hugging her tightly. "Are you okay, my love?" Lorenzo asked, his eyes filled with concern. Beatrice was still trembling, but she nodded slowly. "I knew you were here, Dad. I knew you would protect me." Lorenzo felt tears welling up in his own eyes. He kissed Beatrice's head, holding her even tighter. "I will always be here for you, my love. Always." The sound of the front door slamming still echoed through the house as Lorenzo continued to hold Beatrice in his arms. She was still shaking, but he could feel that the worst was over. Beatrice was safe. Clara would no longer be a part of their lives, and Lorenzo had managed to fulfill his promise to protect her. But as much as relief was present, Lorenzo knew that the next steps would be crucial for his daughter's recovery. Beatrice had been through so much in the past few months, and the trauma wouldn't disappear so quickly. He held her tightly, feeling her small, fragile body in his arms, and silently promised that he would be by her side every step of this journey. When they finally pulled away a little, Lorenzo looked at Beatrice's face. She still had swollen eyes from crying so much, but there was something different in her expression. The fear that had previously dominated her gaze now seemed to be giving way to a feeling of safety. "Daddy, is she gone?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling but calmer. "Yes, sweetheart. She's gone, and she will never come back. I promise you that," Lorenzo replied, holding his daughter's hands firmly. Beatrice nodded, seeming a bit relieved, but Lorenzo knew she was still processing everything that had happened. He took a deep breath, trying to think of ways to help his daughter recover from this nightmare. "I was so scared, Daddy," Beatrice murmured, looking down. "I thought you wouldn't believe me." Lorenzo felt a pang in his chest. Knowing that his daughter had doubts about his trust hurt him deeply, but he understood why she felt that way. Clara had planted those doubts in Beatrice's mind, and Lorenzo knew he would have to work hard to ensure that his daughter would never question the love and protection he would always provide. "Beatrice, I will always believe you," he said firmly, cupping her face in his hands. "Always. No matter what happens, you can trust me. You are the most important thing in my life, and I will never let anyone hurt you again." Beatrice looked at him for a few seconds, absorbing his words, and finally nodded with a slight smile on her lips. "Thank you, Daddy. I love you so much," she said softly. "I love you too, my brave little girl," Lorenzo replied, feeling relieved to see the first sign of serenity in his daughter. As the comforting silence filled the house, Lorenzo knew that the next step was essential to solidifying Beatrice's emotional security. The idea of involving her in something that would distract her and make her feel safer came to his mind. "How about we do something special today?" Lorenzo suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "We can order your favorite pizza and watch a movie. What do you think?" Beatrice looked at him with a shy sparkle in her eyes, clearly more excited about the idea. "Can we order it with lots of cheese?" she asked, now smiling slightly. "With all the cheese you want," Lorenzo replied, chuckling softly. "I think we deserve it, don't you?" Beatrice's smile eased Lorenzo's heart. Even if it was just the beginning of a long recovery, he got up and headed to the kitchen to grab the phone while Beatrice followed him, now calmer. As Lorenzo called the pizzeria, Beatrice disappeared for a few moments but soon returned with a notebook and some colored pencils. She sat at the kitchen table next to her father and began drawing something with great concentration. Curious, Lorenzo hung up the phone after placing the order and leaned closer to his daughter. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting beside her. Beatrice looked up, her shy smile still present. "I'm drawing our new security system. I want to help plan it," she replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lorenzo couldn't help but smile at Beatrice's dedication to her new project. He looked at the drawing she was making. There were cameras, sensors, and even what appeared to be invisible lasers to protect the house. It was as if she were creating a real fortress to protect herself and, at the same time, regain her sense of security. "That's a great security system, Agent Beatrice," Lorenzo joked, playing along. "I think we need invisible lasers, right?" Beatrice giggled softly, nodding enthusiastically. "Of course, Daddy. All good security systems have invisible lasers. That way, no one can break into our house again." The lightness in his daughter's tone was exactly what Lorenzo needed at that moment. The sound of Beatrice's laughter echoed through the house, bringing a sense of relief and hope. Even after everything that had happened, he felt that they were finally starting to walk the path of healing together. "Let's do this," Lorenzo said with a determined smile. "Let's turn this house into the safest fortress in the city." Beatrice seemed genuinely excited about the idea, and Lorenzo felt grateful to see his daughter smiling again. Even if it was just the beginning of a long healing journey, he knew that the emotional trauma would still be present for a while, but moments like this were precious and showed that they were heading in the right direction. Shortly after, the doorbell rang, and Lorenzo realized it was the pizza. He got up, looked through the peephole to make sure everything was okay, and opened the door. "It's okay, sweetheart. It's just the pizza delivery guy," he said to Beatrice, who had tensed a bit at the sound of the doorbell. They sat together at the kitchen table, devouring the extra cheese pizza and watching a spy movie that Beatrice had chosen, as if they were secret agents on a special mission. As they ate and laughed, Lorenzo felt more confident that, with time, patience, and a lot of love, he could help his daughter overcome this painful chapter in their lives. By the end of the night, when Beatrice was already in her pajamas and ready for bed, Lorenzo tucked her in and kissed her forehead. "Good night, my love. Remember, I'm always here for you," he said tenderly. Beatrice looked at him with trusting eyes and replied with a slight smile, "I know, Daddy. I trust you." The next morning arrived with a lighter atmosphere in the house, but the weight of the event still lingered, especially for Beatrice. They started the day calmly, preparing breakfast together. Beatrice was visibly calmer, laughing here and there, although she still displayed a slight nervousness in her gestures and glances. Lorenzo tried to stay optimistic, savoring every small moment of joy as a victory. "Dad, today I was thinking, can we go out for a bit?" Beatrice suddenly asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe take a walk in the park?" Lorenzo was surprised by the suggestion. He didn't expect Beatrice to feel ready to leave the house so soon, especially after everything that had happened. However, he understood that this was an important step in her recovery. Facing her fears and rebuilding her confidence in the outside world was crucial. "Of course, sweetheart. We can go to the park," Lorenzo replied with an encouraging smile. "The day is beautiful. It will be nice to get out and breathe some fresh air." Beatrice smiled back, although there was still a hint of uncertainty in her gaze. Lorenzo knew that this outing would be more than just a simple trip. It would be a test to see how Beatrice felt outside the safe environment they had created at home. After breakfast, they got ready and left the house. As they stepped onto the street, Lorenzo noticed how Beatrice held his hand more tightly than usual, her eyes alert to everything around them. It was as if the world outside was still a threat to her, and Lorenzo knew that this was part of the process. "It's okay, sweetheart. I'm here with you," he said, squeezing his daughter's hand to convey reassurance. "I know, Dad," Beatrice replied, her voice calm, but he could feel the tension in her body. As they walked to the park, Lorenzo carefully observed his daughter's behavior. She stayed close to him, avoiding eye contact with the other people passing by. Even so, Lorenzo noticed that Beatrice was trying to be brave. She knew she needed to face her fears, and she was doing it one step at a time. Upon arriving at the park, they found a quiet bench under a tree. Beatrice let out a sigh of relief as she sat down next to her father, looking around at the trees and the few children playing in the distance. The sound of birds and the gentle breeze created a calming atmosphere, and Lorenzo hoped it would help Beatrice relax. "Are you feeling okay?" Lorenzo asked, watching his daughter's face closely. "I am a little nervous, but I'm okay," Beatrice admitted, her eyes still wandering around the park. Lorenzo smiled and draped his arm over Beatrice's shoulders, pulling her gently closer to him. "It's normal to feel this way, sweetheart. Takes time to feel safe again after what happened. But we'll get through this together. Whenever you feel nervous or scared, remember that I'm here, and nothing will hurt you." Beatrice nodded, resting her head on her father's shoulder. Lorenzo felt a mix of pride and sadness. His daughter was brave, even after everything she had suffered. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that Beatrice had an incredible inner strength. "Dad," Beatrice began after a few minutes of silence, "do you think Clara will come back?" The question, though predictable, made Lorenzo's stomach churn. He knew that Beatrice still carried the fear that Clara might appear again and threaten the peace they had achieved. "No, my love, she won't come back," Lorenzo replied firmly. "I made sure of that, and even if she tried, we are protected now. No one will hurt us again." Beatrice looked at him, seeking comfort in the safety of her father's words. She wanted to believe that the danger had passed, but Lorenzo knew it would take time before she could truly relax. "I will protect you, always," Lorenzo repeated, wanting to reinforce this idea in his daughter's mind. They stayed there for a while, enjoying the sounds of nature and the tranquility of the park. Gradually, Beatrice seemed to calm down, and Lorenzo saw that the outing was having a positive effect on her. "How about ice cream?" Lorenzo suggested, trying to cheer her up even more. Beatrice looked at him with a shy smile and nodded. They got up and walked to the ice cream cart that was parked nearby. Lorenzo watched his daughter as she chose her flavor, seeing how she began to relax and distract herself with the simplicity of that moment. While Beatrice ate her ice cream, Lorenzo enjoyed the silence. He knew there was much ahead, but moments like this were precious. They were the small victories that indicated they were on the right track. After finishing their ice cream, they continued walking through the park. Beatrice seemed more at ease, her steps lighter, and Lorenzo felt more hopeful. However, he knew it was important not to push too hard and to respect her time to recover. The trauma his daughter carried wouldn't disappear all at once, but with time, patience, and love, she would return to being the cheerful girl she had always been. Back at the apartment, the day continued peacefully. They played together and watched a movie in the late afternoon, as if life was gradually returning to normal. Lorenzo observed every small sign of progress in Beatrice's smile. When night came and Lorenzo tucked Beatrice into bed, he knew there was still much to be done, but one thing was clear. They were overcoming the trauma one step at a time, and Lorenzo would never let Beatrice face it alone. "Dad?" Beatrice called softly as Lorenzo was about to leave the room. "Thank you for taking care of me. I trust you." Lorenzo felt his heart tighten, but this time with gratitude and pride. "Always, sweetheart. I will always be here to protect you," he replied softly, kissing his daughter's forehead before leaving the room. That morning, Lorenzo decided it was time to take another important step in his daughter's healing journey. They were sitting at the kitchen table having breakfast when Lorenzo brought up something he had been thinking about for some time. "Beatrice, dear," he began softly, stirring his cup of coffee. "I've been thinking. I think it would be good for you to talk to someone about what happened. Someone who can help you understand better what you felt and help you heal." Beatrice looked up from her bowl of cereal, gazing at her father with a slight hint of doubt. Lorenzo knew this conversation would be delicate. He didn't want his daughter to feel pressured, but rather welcomed and understood. "You mean talk to someone else about Clara?" she asked, a bit nervously. Lorenzo nodded, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "Yes, but this person would be someone who understands how these things can affect us and can help you understand what happened. It wouldn't just be about Clara. It would be about how you are feeling now. I think talking to a psychologist can help you feel even stronger and more secure." Beatrice furrowed her brow slightly, deep in thought. It was clear that the idea made her a bit uneasy, but at the same time, there was a quiet curiosity in her eyes. Lorenzo continued, trying to soothe her. "I will be with you every step of the way, dear. You don't have to do anything alone. I just want you to know that talking about how you feel is important, and sometimes it can help us make things clearer and less frightening." Beatrice took a deep breath and looked at her father, seeking the trust he always conveyed. "Do you think this will help me, Dad?" she asked, her voice laden with uncertainty. "I'm sure it will," Lorenzo replied firmly, "and I will be with you every step of the way. We are not alone in this, Beatrice, and it's important for you to know that it's okay to ask for help when we need it." Beatrice nodded slowly, absorbing her father's words. She knew she still had a lot to process and that, although she was feeling more secure at home, there were parts of herself that were still fragile. After a few moments of silence, she finally responded, "It's okay, Dad. I will try." Lorenzo smiled, relieved by his daughter's decision. He knew that the road ahead would still be long, but this was an important step, and he was determined to ensure Beatrice received all the support she needed to overcome the trauma. The following week, Lorenzo scheduled an appointment with a psychologist who specialized in working with children. On the day of the appointment, Beatrice seemed a bit nervous, but Lorenzo reassured her, assuring her that everything would be all right. When they arrived at the office, Beatrice squeezed Lorenzo's hand tightly, and he bent down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "Do you remember what we talked about?" he said gently. "There's nothing here for you to fear. This is someone who is here to help you. You don't need to be afraid to say what you're feeling." Beatrice nodded, and the two of them entered the office. The psychologist, a woman with a warm smile and kind eyes, did her best to make Beatrice feel comfortable from the start. Lorenzo stayed in the room for a while until Beatrice felt safe enough to talk alone with the therapist. While waiting outside, Lorenzo couldn't help but feel nervous. He knew this was the right thing to do, but he also knew he was handing over a part of his daughter to someone he hoped would help her cope with her pain. He just wanted Beatrice to feel safe and healed. After some time, the door to the room opened, and Beatrice came out, a slight smile on her face. She seemed calmer, although Lorenzo knew this was just the beginning. He stood up and walked over to her. "How was it, dear?" he asked, trying to gauge his daughter's emotional state. "It was good," Beatrice replied, her voice soft. "She asked me some questions, and I talked a little about Clara. I felt good afterward." Lorenzo smiled, relieved by her answer. "That's great, my love. I knew you would do well." In the days that followed, Beatrice began having weekly sessions with the psychologist. With each new visit, Lorenzo saw his daughter gain more confidence and find ways to express her feelings. Gradually, she spoke more freely about the months she spent living in fear, and Lorenzo knew that, over time, Beatrice was beginning to free herself from the trauma. He also noticed small changes in her routine. Beatrice seemed lighter, more comfortable, and little by little, the sparkle in her eyes, which had previously dimmed, began to return. The healing process was visible, and Lorenzo, proud, observed each progress. One night, after one of the sessions, Beatrice approached Lorenzo while he was washing the dishes. She looked hesitant but determined. "Dad, can I tell you something?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "Of course, my love. You can always tell me anything," Lorenzo replied, turning off the faucet and focusing all his attention on his daughter. I'm starting to feel better. I think, for a while I thought I would always be afraid that I would never feel safe again. But now, with the sessions, I think I'm learning that I can feel good again. And that's because of you too." Lorenzo felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He crouched down to Beatrice's level and hugged her, feeling extremely grateful for her progress. "I'm so proud of you, Beatrice. You are very brave, and that's why we're going through this together. I will always be here to help you, my love." Beatrice smiled and hugged him back, feeling stronger and more confident than she had in a long time. Time passed, and with it, Beatrice's emotional scars began to heal. The sessions with the psychologist continued to help her process everything that had happened, and Lorenzo couldn't be prouder of his daughter's progress. He saw the girl who once lived in fear transformed back into a child full of energy, curiosity, and smiles. Life for both of them had found a new rhythm, a new normalcy. Each day, the dark memories of Clara and the fear she brought faded further away, making room for the light that began to shine in Beatrice once again. The conversations between father and daughter became more frequent and more open. Beatrice no longer hesitated to tell Lorenzo everything she felt, creating an unbreakable bond between them. One morning, a few months after everything they had been through, Lorenzo woke up to the soft sound of laughter coming from the living room. He got up, curious, and walked down the hallway. Upon entering the living room, he found Beatrice drawing in her notebook, surrounded by colored pencils scattered across the table. She looked happy and at peace, something Lorenzo had fought so hard to provide. "Good morning, my love," Lorenzo said with a gentle smile as he entered the room. Beatrice looked up at him and smiled, her eyes sparkling. "Good morning, Daddy. I was drawing a new design for our house. I want to make a garden on the terrace with flowers and a fountain," she explained enthusiastically. Lorenzo approached to look at the drawing, which showed colorful flowers, butterflies, and a small green space in the corner of the apartment terrace. The drawing was vibrant, just like Beatrice herself. "That's an amazing idea, Beatrice. I think it's going to be a beautiful garden. We can start working on it whenever you're ready," Lorenzo said, proud of his daughter's creativity. Beatrice smiled even wider, excited about the project. "Can we buy the plants today? I want it to be the most beautiful garden ever," she replied, already full of plans for her new creation. Lorenzo nodded, and the two spent the morning planning together what the garden would look like. As they jotted down ideas and discussed the colors of the flowers, Lorenzo realized something that filled him with gratitude: the lightness that had returned to Beatrice's life. What once felt like a constant burden was now replaced by dreams and hopes for a peaceful future. After breakfast, they went out together to buy the plants and materials needed for the garden. Beatrice was radiant, carefully choosing each flower as if each one had a special meaning. For Lorenzo, that outing was more than just a trip to the garden store. It was a symbol of the new phase they were entering, a phase of rebuilding and rebirth. Upon returning home, they spent the rest of the day working on the terrace. The sun shone in the sky, and the air was fresh, perfect for an afternoon of gardening. Lorenzo and Beatrice planted the chosen flowers together, laughing and having fun at every step of the process. It was as if the terrace was transforming not just into a garden but into a space of healing and joy. As Lorenzo buried the roots of the flowers in the fresh soil, he looked at Beatrice, who was focused on organizing the pots. She looked so happy, so at peace. It was hard to believe that just a few months ago, she had been living in fear and uncertainty. Seeing his daughter bloom like this was the greatest reward he could have. "Daddy, do you think the butterflies will like our garden?" Beatrice suddenly asked, interrupting his thoughts. Lorenzo smiled and moved closer, wiping his dirty hands on his pants. "I'm sure they will. With all the care you're putting into this, the butterflies will love it. And who knows, maybe the birds will come visit us too," he said, stroking his daughter's hair. Beatrice looked up at the sky and smiled, as if she could already see the butterflies flying around. Lorenzo felt overwhelmed by a sense of peace, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The certainty that they had overcome the hardest moments was there, present in his daughter's smile. When the garden was finally ready, the sun began to set on the horizon. The newly planted flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and Beatrice, sitting next to Lorenzo, admired the work they had done. "It looks beautiful, Daddy," she said with a satisfied smile. "I think our home is complete now." Lorenzo looked at the garden and then at his daughter, feeling his heart swell with pride and love. "Yes, it turned out perfect," he agreed, hugging Beatrice close. "And you know what else? We did this together." Beatrice looked at her father, her eyes full of tenderness. "We're a good team, right, Daddy? The best team in the world," Lorenzo replied, squeezing her gently against him. As the sun slowly disappeared on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Lorenzo knew that the worst was behind them. He and Beatrice had faced storms, and although the scars were still there, now there was something stronger than fear: the love and trust they had in each other. The future looked promising, full of possibilities. They had found strength in one another, and with that, they were ready to face any challenge that might arise. Beatrice was a strong girl, and Lorenzo knew she was ready to bloom at her own pace, just like the flowers they had planted together in that garden. And in that moment, as the silence of the night began to spread, Lorenzo and Beatrice sat on the terrace, enjoying the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. It was a new dawn for both of them, a fresh start full of hope and love.